Greetings historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon. In the Legend of Spyro, fantastical abilities are shown to be wielded by a small, chosen group of dragons. A prime example of this being the purple dragon of Legend, while their power is one of which that can rival the power of stars, and single-handedly define entire ages. Another is responsible for writing down and protecting accounts of the events that transpired during these long spans of time. For thousands of years, these chosen individuals watch the history of the dragons unfold before their eyes, watching and almost never interfering, passing the knowledge they gain down to the next who might take up the title. To those who know of them, they're a myth, their presence buried behind what most would call superstition. But those who do know of them, interference from these seemingly mythological characters signals catastrophe for whomever resides in the realms. The characters in question today are the Chroniclers. The few that we know of and can assume existed, that is. We will be looking into their role, their history, and see how they might be able to come back to Spyro if given the opportunity. So, what is the Chronicler exactly? In short, the Chronicler has been shown to primarily be a custodian and a historian, writing down various events and individuals into books and scrolls, even down to the smallest detail. Their primary element, as far as we can see, is the time element, more so known as Dragon Time. And due to this time element, there have been many times where a Chronicler has been able to see even into the future. Each detail is put into something called the Books of Time, which, according to one of the Chroniclers we pay witness to, contains most of dragon history and dates back to almost the beginning of time. Why there seems to be a gap in the knowledge kept by the Chroniclers is never explained, but I'll get into my thoughts on that later. And I'll mention it again as we talk about a certain inconsistency within the actual Legend of Spyro trilogy. After these different scrolls and books were filled, the Chronicler would carry them with him, with one book on his belt and the scrolls being held in something called the Tome of Knowledge. The rest would be adorning ancient shelves, kept in a place known as the Celestial Caves, a place that laid hidden within a temple on a lone outcropping of rock surrounded by a vast ocean, called the White Isle. Something to note is the Chronicler can't actually leave the White Isle, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Before we go further, I'd like to highlight this part about the Chronicler being in these Celestial Caves, as the term Celestial could tell us, or at least clarify something about the Chronicler that wasn't really brought up in the games. This will be important for later once we actually get into the history of the Chroniclers. The term Celestial, especially in storytelling, means either something belonging to the cosmos, or it means something relating to heaven. While the first meaning for Celestial is used and somewhat fleshed out when it comes to the purple dragon's power, as it's compared to stars, it's never told to us what it means in the context of the Celestial Caves. It can be assumed pretty quickly that in this case, it more likely means something to do with what the dragons might consider heaven, or at least an afterlife. As most of the time in the Legend of Spyro, Celestial is a term most associated with the ancestors, those that have passed on and now live in whatever this afterlife might be. Now, I imagine, in this context, it is the same for the Celestial Caves. But outside the name and maybe appearance, nothing about them truly seems celestial, at least by this definition. However, the theory that I have is somehow the Celestial Caves are almost a meeting place between the Celestial Realm and the normal realms that we know of. And this will be important for later. To explain my thoughts on why the Chronicler seems to have a gap in knowledge, I assume that, near the beginning of time in this universe, the dragons might not have even existed, or maybe they did and didn't develop any sense of writing until much later. It would be when they developed as a species, and developed their technology, and learned to keep records of their history, that the Chronicler legacy had begun. Maybe at some point, the ancestors saw a dragon, or even a dragon historian, start to exhibit a rather strange skill. And this would be that he could actually have clarity on past events that were never written down, and almost pierce into the future. However, these predictions would be vague at best. Perhaps the ancestors, dragons from previous generations that had perished and moved on to whatever afterlife the dragons had, started to notice this dragon and his strange skill. And maybe, when this dragon perished, he was brought before the ancestors. But, instead of moving forward and into that afterlife the dragons have, he was given a task. And this brings us to how I think a Chronicler is actually selected. Upon a certain dragon's death, they are brought before the ancestors, However, instead of moving forward into that afterlife, if they had either exhibited skills associated with the time element, or perhaps even been a historian like that chronicler we just speculated about, perhaps this hypothetical dragon would become a chronicler. Along with becoming the chronicler, their natural born element would more than likely be erased, and instead its place would be filled by dragon time itself. And usually from what I can tell, a chronicler would meet his successor, and before the past chronicler went on to the afterlife, their successor would go to the White Isle and get these abilities. Now this brings us back to the Celestial Caves. Perhaps, to allow the chronicler to better watch over the history of the dragons, they place him back into the world, perhaps even creating the Celestial Caves themselves. This brings up a question, however. How does the chronicler, if he's already passed on and is now a spirit, stay in the normal world? When I was looking for lore pieces during the making of this video, I came across a display of the first chronicler we see in the games. Around his chest is something called the Heart of the Chronicler. As to what it truly does is speculation, but perhaps it gives them the knowledge of the past chroniclers, or, as was stated earlier, is almost a way to make sure they don't leave the Celestial Caves. And since they've already passed on, it's more than likely for their own good. But either way, that's speculation. If you have any idea for what the Heart of the Chronicler could do, leave them down in the comments. So, why is the Chronicler associated with Doom? And why did this idea start to become part of how people viewed them? Typically, since the Chronicler almost never interferes with what happens in the realms, I imagine at some point in early dragon history, there might have been a Chronicler that tried to warn the dragons of the time of a catastrophe that was about to happen. But since this was probably their first and only encounter with the Chronicler, when this catastrophe struck, they might have associated the Chronicler with that event, and categorized the Chronicler as a sign of doom. However, when this started, I'm not quite sure. That's a whole other beast. It might have happened very early in dragon history, or maybe something a lot closer to what we'll be talking about today. Now, before the history section, I should probably get across the idea of an age, as a single chronicler is in charge of writing down the events of an age. These different ages would be separated by various events created by the purple dragons, as it was their fate to do so. And to give the best idea of an age that I can, I'll be telling you when I believe the age started and when the age ended in the history that we'll be talking about. Now, to the history that isn't speculation. 1,000 years prior to the birth of Spyro, possibly in ancient Warfang, or another dragon city. It's never clarified as far as I know. A scribe, who according to Jared Pollan could have been thousands of years old, though this is just his headcanon, was asked to note down anything with the training session of a purple dragon. In fact, the first purple dragon that seemingly anyone had ever seen. And the group that called the scribe in to document anything about the purple dragon and his training sessions, I believe, actually would form into the Guardians later on in the Legend of Spyro timeline. However, at the time, they were just called the Dragon Elders. This scribe, who we both don't know his element or his true name, though people speculate that his element might have been wind, watched as this peculiar young dragon trained under the Dragon Elders, writing down each step he made along the way. The young dragon would master the elements of fire, ice, electricity, and so on. It seemed that this young dragon's power was boundless, and all the secrets that these Dragon Elders knew would be willingly passed down to him. However, this would come at a cost. Over time, the scribe saw arrogance rising within the purple dragon, until ultimately he was banished by the Dragon Elders for this arrogance, and for the time being, that seemed to be the end of it. However, soon the young dragon would come back, this time with an army. Fueled by hate, Malefor, the young dragon the scribe had been watching for all this time, led a war against the dragons and their allies. I assume it was at this point that perhaps the scribe's life was actually taken. However, perhaps during his life, he had shown a strange ability, one that had not been seen perhaps for 1,000 years, the ability to almost glimpse into time. Because of this, he would be brought before the ancestors, his fate leading him to an honor that only few knew. This is the part where the speculation from earlier comes in, mainly about how a chronicler is chosen, primarily through their dedication and slight ability to glimpse into time, though I imagine at some point it might be either or. This is headcanon, but at some point, maybe he showed each of these traits, and like those before him, he was given the role of chronicler. he would be brought to the White Isle and go through the Celestial Caves, finding the chronicler of his own age. But given that this war had started, and more than likely Malefor had brought upon an age of darkness, by tradition of the chronicler, the scribe would be given the heart of the chronicler, and entrusted with the position for however long this age would last. Now, to move forward with the story of the chronicler, I'm actually going to be delving into the story of Malefor, as a lot of his actions intertwine with the stories of, well, most characters in the Legend of Spyro. This will bring us back to actually before the war even started, to a place called the Mountain of Malefor, or better known as the Well of Souls. The Mountain of Malefor served as a fortress for the fallen Purple Dragon during the beginning of the war, and would actually be a concentration of dark magic, likes of which the world of the Legend of Spyro had never seen before. However, not only did this place serve as a fortress, but due to the dark magic, there might have been an unforeseen consequence. It was possibly near this time as well that something new began, something called the Night of Eternal Darkness. This night, when the moons of Zela and Adrano would actually eclipse each other, for whatever reason, possibly due to Malefor, through some sort of magic, would draw those of a darkened heart to the Mountain of Malefor, and let those of a darkened heart that are deceased walk the halls of the Mountain of Malefor. Now, later in the war, at some point, dragons during that time, or at least I speculate, however they're really just called the ancestors, were able to vanquish Malefor. In a rather unusual way, however. Rather than him being vanquished from the realms altogether, he was actually split up into two different entities. One would be his essence, which would actually be kept in an alternate dimension known as convexity, and his soul would actually be kept in the Mountain of Malefor, mainly now due to him being a creature of darkness. 1,000 years passed since the age began, and war had left the dragons weakened and broken. It would be during this time of war that he more than likely would observe another dragon, one actually that took up the position as Fire Guardian, an order of dragons perhaps descended from the dragon elders of old. This dragon was one that could seemingly glimpse into the future, though only with something called the Pool of Visions. This dragon would be named Ignitus. At least in my own headcanon, the fact that he can glimpse into time leads to something in the future, and something I'll get into later. Along with all the other dragon generations that were being born into the world after the war had started, another purple dragon would enter the world, and a chronicler would watch as this young dragon went through trials before he was even hatched. And more than likely, like with most characters, a book of time would more than likely be dedicated to this new purple dragon, one that would be called Spyro. Along with Spyro, there would be another dragon that the chronicler observed, and this would be a dragoness by the name of Cinder, a dragoness who was actually in the same clutch of eggs as Spyro. However, over time, the chronicler would watch as these two dragons and their paths diverged. Spyro living in relative peace, with only a few moments of turmoil during the beginning of his story, and Cinder who was instead corrupted and forced to fight for Malefor. After Spyro freed Cinder from this evil, or rather Malefor, the two would stay in a place called the Dragon Temple, under the watch of the Guardians. A night would come, however, that Cinder tried to sneak away, and when she was asked why she would leave by Spyro, she simply answered that she didn't belong. It was more than likely at this point that the chronicler saw a future, one in which the recently liberated Cinder would turn back to her old master, and once again help plunge the world into darkness, and more likely in the end lead to the end of Spyro, the world's last hope. To rendering Spyro unconscious, probably through some sort of magic, as the chronicler during this time not only seemed to develop telekinesis, but also was shown to be using some sort of dream manipulation and had the ability to render people unconscious. It would be through one of these dreams that the chronicler was able to contact the young dragon, telling the young dragon to seek him out, and that something was coming, the Night of Eternal Darkness. As previously stated, this Night of Eternal Darkness would allow those of a darkened heart to walk the halls of the Mountain of Malefor, and since Malefor's soul was actually kept within the fortress, and his essence was freed from convexity by Cinder while she was still under his influence, the chronicler theorized that Malefor might have been able to come back and not only be able to walk the halls of the Well of Souls, but be able to go beyond that. And this would lead to a revival of the Dark Master. This theory would be mentioned later to Spyro, but I'll get to that when we actually get to that point. It will be at this moment that Spyro set out on a quest to find the chronicler, but also find Cinder, wherever she might have gone. However, this quest would be a rather dangerous one, as Spyro actually didn't have his elements, and so, through some magic-induced dreams, mostly at the worst times, the Chronicler helped him to discover the time element and how to use it, and then helped him rediscover his different elements that he had lost in a fight with Cinder while she was still corrupted by the Dark Master. Though he did note that the time element was not something to toy with. Slowly, the Chronicler would lead Spyro to the White Isle, and eventually, the Purple Dragon was flying across an ocean, and once more, the Chronicler forced Spyro to fall unconscious. But, as fate would have it, a creature known as a Leviathan took Spyro to the White Isle, where tests would take place that would shake Spyro to his core. After traveling through the Celestial Caves, Spyro would encounter an embodiment of what he feared most, and at the time, this would be Cinder, corrupted once again by the Dark Master. The Purple Dragon would beat the manifestation, however, and continued his way through the Celestial Caves to meet the Chronicler. As Spyro marveled at the quantity of books held within the caves, going as far as to say that all dragon history seemed to be within these walls. He was quickly corrected by the Chronicler, as he said that most of history was in the books, not all of it. The Chronicler mentioned that he had been waiting for Spyro, and as the manifestation from before was mentioned, the Chronicler simply said that it was a necessary evil, that he had to be sure. For what reason he had to be sure, that's up to theory, and I'll actually let you guys discuss that in the comments section below. As the dragons conversed, the Chronicler mentioned that there was a book actually covering Spyro's life, and the Chronicler telekinetically brought it over, opening it and showing Spyro his beginnings. It was also mentioned that these books can have glimpses of the future, but for what those glimpses were, in the case of Spyro, is never mentioned here. Spyro, seeing the chance to glimpse into the future, asked to know what might happen to Cinder, who at the time was captured by the Dark Army. The Chronicler more likely believed that his explanation, however, would drive Spyro to try and stop what the Chronicler predicted. And it was at this point that the Chronicler told Spyro of Cinder's beginnings, her corruption, her years of servitude to the Dark Master, and how eventually, once she was brought back to the Well of Souls, either by her own choice or by force, and if Malefor was to return, she would join him once again, as according to the Chronicler, she knew no other way. Spyro, of course, rejected the idea, but the Chronicler pressed on, even going as far as to tell Spyro the beginnings of Malefor. And this would actually be where he mentions that Malefor was the first purple dragon. But anyway, I digress. The Chronicler told Spyro that even with Malefor trapped within the Well of Souls, that his sheer power and the Night of Eternal Darkness coupled together might allow his soul to escape its captivity, and allow him to walk among the living once more. And this is actually where the theory I mentioned before comes into the story. In response to all of this, both the news about Cinder and Malefor, Spyro asked what might be done to try and stop this. However, the Chronicler simply said it had been written, implying that he thought that nothing could change it, even the Purple Dragon of legend. Spyro then asked why he was even brought to the White Isle in the first place, and the old dragon's explanation was simple, so that Spyro could wait, gather his strength, fight the Dark Master's forces, and most likely Cinder another day. Spyro then asked about the others fighting the Dark Armies, and what might happen to them, and questioned why they should let what the Chronicler predicted just happen to Cinder. As just like the first time that she was corrupted, she never had a choice in the matter, and to give her that choice, Spyro set out to save Cinder, disregarding whatever warning the Chronicler gave him. But surprisingly, the Chronicler, despite his own fears as to what might happen, let Spyro go, not wanting to see him grief-stricken over the knowledge of what might have happened if he stayed. As Spyro prepared to leave, the Chronicler told him the very things he would need to succeed to save Cinder, and to resist the temptation of the Knight of Eternal Darkness himself, and these would be a clear mind and a pure heart. Spyro set out to the Well of Souls, as it was more likely what the Dark Armies brought Cinder, mainly because of the Night of Eternal Darkness. Spyro's rescue attempt was more or less successful. However, due to a fight and an unstable structure, the Well of Souls started to collapse in on itself, leaving Spyro, Sparks, who had accompanied the Purple Dragon, and Cinder trapped within the rocks. But before the mountain could crush them, Spyro then remembered something the Chronicler said about living to fight another day, and this gave him an idea. As the rocks fell around them, Spyro encased the three of them in something called the Time Crystal, freezing them in suspended animation and driving all of them into a deep slumber. As Spyro drifted off, the Chronicler spoke to Spyro once more, giving him a warning of what world he might be stepping into once he and the others had broken free from the crystal, but that once they did, they would surely have allies. 3 years later, after members of the Dark Army broke the dragons and Dragonfly out of their crystal refuge and brought them from the Well of Souls to a place called the Catacombs, they were rescued by a cheetah, one that went by the name of Hunter, who was instructed to lead them to the dragon city of Warfang. But as they made their way out of the catacombs, to allow Spyro and Cinder to use their elemental attacks, they had to find a crystal that would rejuvenate their energy. But as they did, the Chronicler spoke once again to Spyro, as well as Cinder, telling them of their elements, and that now it was time to awaken them. He explained, especially in the case of Cinder, that her time under the influence of dark magic had gifted her abilities most might have not thought possible. The last time we see this scribe, or as he had been for 1,000 years, the Chronicler, was actually after the war with Malefor had ended. This point marked the end of an age, and, as is with the role of the Chronicler, it had to be passed on to someone who could actually take up the title. And perhaps due to the fact that he could tap into dragon time a little bit through the Pool of Visions, the Fire Guardian Ignitus was chosen to take up the mantle of Chronicler. However, before the Chronicler faded away, the Fire Guardian asked what had become of Spyro, the new purple dragon. As the last time Ignitus had seen him, he was in the center of the world with Cinder, as a result of their fight with the Dark Master. During this fight, the world had shattered, and its pieces started to float away from the core. And to save it, Spyro used his power to try to drag the world back together, to hopefully mend this broken planet. However, this left Spyro and Cinder in a very risky position, as there was a danger of being crushed by the very planet they were trying to save. In fact, that's what the two dragons thought would happen. This brings us to another set of books that the Chronicler has, which records all the dragons that had perished from the realms. With the dragon passing, a new page is written in this book. However, Spyro and Cinder weren't in the book. The Chronicler couldn't exactly figure out what happened to them, even to the best of his ability. And as he faded, and left the title of Chronicler to Ignitus, as his main task, he was told that the role of Chronicler was to chronicle the triumphs and failures of this new age. And it might have been due to this fact, or for his own personal reasons, that he started looking for Spyro, picking up his search where the previous Chronicler left off. He eventually would find the Purple Dragon, and Cinder, and perhaps this is where the story of the New Age began, with him chronicling the adventure of these two dragons in the New Age. And, of course, he would continue this for however long the New Age would last. Now there's one thing I want to mention before we get into speculation. This is when the Chronicler says that Malefor was the first purple dragon, as this is a rather strange topic. Why is this an issue? Well, in Dawn of the Dragon, the Dark Master was speaking about what he thought was the purpose of the purple dragon, and mentioned that there had been many, and he was not actually the first. Now, there's a pretty clear answer to this, and it has to do with the Dark Master lying to Spyro. Maybe to convince him to join him or fill him with doubt. Maybe. But there's another explanation which I find a bit more interesting. Another thought I had was that maybe the Chronicler didn't know because that knowledge had been erased from history somehow. Maybe for some reason, a past Chronicler removed the knowledge from the Celestial Caves. Quite honestly, I'm not quite sure that would be a very feasible reason. But more likely, it's just something that the devs didn't think about. Now, speculation. How could something like the Chronicler come back to the current Spyro universe? Well, one of the ways I actually do see him coming back is maybe being part of the Dragon Realms. Maybe even being from Magic Crafters or Dreamweavers. Perhaps he could have lived in one of them at one point and moved to the other, giving him knowledge of both realms and their techniques. This might give him the same abilities he has in the Legend of Spyro, but this would allow him to gain that knowledge through pre-existing lore. He could have a place in the Dragon Realms where you could go to meet him, and he could tell you of certain elements the dragons used to have, and how Spyro might be able to tap into them, just as the ancient dragons did. I'm not quite sure his original take would fit in the world of the Reignited trilogy, but I imagine, along with a few other references made to that series, that perhaps they could make it that he lives off on a secluded island, and studies the flow of time, marking important events. Maybe even if this was the case, he could give Spyro tidbits of lore that explain the world of Spyro just a little more. Just for us lore fans. He could in this case help Spyro rediscover dragon history, and perhaps that history is important to whatever the next threat is in the next Spyro game. Maybe through some method of how to beat this enemy, maybe through rediscovering a certain type of magic? That's a bit up in the air. Perhaps it could work the same way, or maybe it's a family lineage, with the title of Chronicler being passed down from generation to generation. Perhaps something like this could date back even to the early days of the dragons being in the Forgotten Realms, and at some point they were almost fortune tellers. But unlike most fortune tellers, what they actually predicted would most of the time come true, making them rather popular among the ancient dragons. But when their banishment came, perhaps the dragons blamed them for not predicting it and allowing them to prepare, and these Chronicler dragons went into hiding. But due to the next threat to the Spyro world, the dragons send Spyro to find these Chronicler dragons, after knowledge of their existence is rediscovered due to the dragons rediscovering the Forgotten Realms. And somehow these Chronicler dragons help beat this next threat, and maybe even clear their name. But anyway, that's going to be it for me. Now, I will say this video is coming out a bit later than I expected, mainly because of its length and a couple problems I ran into while actually making the video in the first place. And because of that, for this day forward, I'm going to be plugging my Twitter in the description box below, and I'll have something of the name right on the end screen. Mainly because if you want to stay updated, you can go follow me on Twitter, and I'll try to be posting stuff about the process of the video, when it might come out, and generally how the video is doing. Just so that you can stay updated on when the next lore video is coming out, since these sometimes take a bit longer than the average video. But anyway, to simplify that, if you want to have an update as to and how videos are doing, just follow me on Twitter and I'll make sure to try and at least post an update about how exactly a video is doing any given week. But with that said, I'll see you all in the next lore video. Stay safe, historians.